I am a that's been a constant challenge throughout the centuries to think this through. Augustine was one of those who had to engage with that and think this through. But now when I say Augustine, I have a problem, because Augustine has a long paper trail, a lot of books, and perhaps you come here with an image of Augustine that we have to contend with. Perhaps when you hear the name Augustine, it conjures up for you the scholar. This is my favorite image, by the way, of Augustine. I had that posted above my desk as I was dissertating to inspire me. Because for me, somebody interested in Augustine's ancient works on Genesis, his commentaries on Genesis, as I specialized in Genesis 1 to 3, and focused on Augustine's interaction with Greco-Roman science. Well, there's all sorts of interesting things here. For anyone interested in history of science, there's astrolabes in the closet, an armillary sphere from Ptolemy, and other scientific instruments that are found in this room. So I loved it. It was great. Actually, it doesn't have anything to do with Genesis commentary or science, and that's another story. But maybe you think of him as the scholar, or perhaps when you conjure up Augustine, you think of him as the writer of so many books. There's Augustine, second from the left. So your image of Augustine is somebody who wrote an awful lot, and you maybe don't want to be bothered to get through it all, or maybe you've tried. If you meet somebody who says they've read all of Augustine, bring an edge of skepticism to your response. I've met my mentor, Gerald Bonner, said that and did, and I was a believable man, and his knowledge base was certainly the case that it suggested it, but I haven't met many people who have made that claim whom I've trusted with that claim. Perhaps you think of Augustine the contemplative. This might be the image of Augustine for some of you. I suspect for many around, I don't know in this room, it's the antagonist. It's the hammer of God raining down the authority of God on Pelagius and his heresy. This is Augustine the heretic hunter, if you will. Maybe that's the image you have of Augustine. Or perhaps, I think better for many, Augustine the preacher. Augustine who gave somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 sermons in his lifetime. Augustine who made his fame as a preacher. For many over time, though, this is the image that's dominated. This is perhaps, in the history of thought, the most important image of Augustine. Anyone recognize this or him there? It's actually not Augustine. It's his sometime student Orosius, who Augustine commissioned to write a compendium to the City of God. The City of God, which Augustine described as his great and arduous book. Really a hard book to work with. Who's tried reading it? Any of you? Read some of it? All of it? It's a big work, right? Well, it's not just big for us. In the centuries after Augustine, it was a hard book to read and understand. And his work, Orosius' work, was taken as a kind of summary or cliff notes, if you will, of the City of God. And many read it, including Alcuin of York, who is the theorist, the theologian who developed the notion of the Holy Roman Empire for Charlemagne, did so predicating it on Augustine's work, as in saying, I am representing Augustine's thought because he got it out of Orosius. Except Augustine would offer no such idea. That has nothing to do, a Holy Roman Empire that wasn't very holy. Under Charlemagne, it wasn't actually very Roman, and it only took up the area of sort of modern-day France. So how big of an empire was that? Moderate. So I'm not sure what you think about it, so you may have to put some ideas aside about Augustine as you start thinking as we engage with this, depending on what image you came with, and there are other things we could have put up. Those were just some representative ones. It's well to remember that Augustine was a real person who lived in a time and place, and that time and place really shaped the way he engaged the question that I'm trying to address. It really shaped it because we are people of our context. My father, who's a historian, used to say, a text without a context is a pretext. Without the context, we can't get it right. We can't understand. So for Augustine, the period before his birth really set an important context for what he engaged with. The 3rd century of Rome was one long civil war. In that 35-year period, actually the Civil War was longer than that period, but during that 35-year period in particular, there were 70 emperors, only one of whom died of natural causes. That is, it was civil war, and an emperor killed an emperor, or his soldiers would kill an emperor, and you'd have the next one taking his place for a very short time. It wasn't a very sane job description to take on. So the legions were crossing the Rubicon, that northern Italian river, time after time after time in that century. And it very much shaped it. And during this time, there was a development, particularly, it already was in place, but there was a development of a way of thinking, of a political theology that shaped Roman ideology, and so much so that we'll see in the 4th century became very important to the 4th century church and really shaped it as well. Its own pagan political theology. It was called the Pax Deorum. The Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. And so the Romans thought if they had a certain assumption, and then being great engineers as they were, they thought you could reverse engineer into that assumption. So their assumption was, if things are chaotic amongst us, if there's civil discord, it means someone somewhere is not worshiping the gods aright. So their assumption is, if we worship the gods aright, there will be peace in our time, peace in our city. So we can guarantee peace, civic peace, if all of us are worshiping the gods aright. So, in this period, chaos, civil war, what's the problem? Well, someone's not worshiping God right. Who? Those Christians are acting in a different way. So if you read Eusebius's church history, he will lay out this idea that the Romans hated Christianity and carried out these 10 pogroms, these 10 persecutions of the Christians. And that over-eggs it a bit, because it doesn't put in a context of understanding what was going on in that century and the way that shaped their thinking. This was not about, these attempts were not about persecution for the sake of persecution. It was, how do we restore civic peace? Who are the disruptors of our civic peace? The people who aren't worshiping the gods in the way that we think they ought to be worshiped. The Pax Deorum. So then they're looking for who's different. During this time, Decius, one of the emperors, it was about 260, put in place this idea that you should worship the genius of the empire. That is, worship the divine being of the emperor as a way of protecting himself. This was, in essence, was a loyalty test. And who wouldn't take the loyalty test? Because it was a pagan religious event? The Christians. The Jews too, by the way, but there was a different set of issues going on between Romans and Jews at that time. And so, then you have, moving on into the 4th century, you have more civil war. You have another major civil war under the period of Diocletian. At the end, more persecution, not more civil war, excuse me. Until Diocletian retired to the Dalmatian coast, and then you have civil war again, and further persecutions of the Christians. And into this, then, this young upstart out of York waltzes into Rome, pushes his forces down into Rome. I don't need to be so slangy about that. Pushes his forces down into Rome and wins a victory he shouldn't have won. Constantine going up against Maximian, battling him, Maximian had both the fortifications of Rome as well as the river Tiber. And outnumbered Constantine's forces 3-1. Constantine should have lost that battle. But in the days ahead, he had the sign of the key row, the ancient Christian symbol, painted on the shield of his soldiers, and went into battle and claimed that through the work of the God that protected him, Jesus Christ, he won the battle. And this came into and shaped the ethos, the culture, the vision of the church, and helped usher in this idea of the Pax Deorum, the peace of God. Notice how he's really taking the same idea as the 3rd century Roman political theology and implementing it into his thinking about the nature of a Christian-shaped empire. And Eusebius, writing his church history, does that, as do the bishops who advise Constantine from that time on. It's during this time we have an emperor. That's how you can understand why on earth did Constantine call the Council of Nicaea. Probably all of us in this room, at one time or another, have used the Creed of Nicaea. We say this. It's something that has been a blessing to the church. It was born of this political theology that Constantine needed to bring unity to the community so he would have a safe empire. Then we have things move on in the century. You have Theodosius making Christianity then the sole state religion in 386. And then in the beginning of the next century, this Christian empire faces something it couldn't conceive of, the sack of Rome by a group of heretic, they are Arian Christian Gothic tribes, the sack of Rome. And that's the context that Augustine comes into. Let me give you a little bit more context. So I'm setting up to understand what he does for us and why it's valuable. In his world, evil was very externalized. It was either the state or the demonic. He is the one who begins to help the church think about how we internalize the problem of evil. That's something deeply rooted within myself, not just simply the state out there persecuting me or the demonic tempting me. There's something wrong internally with me. The world he lived in had a deep sense of an animated world, an enchanted world. I'm using enchantment in a very particular sense here. Not that everything was enchanting, but this sense of soul beings. And I've already mentioned the Pax Deorum. And so, in the 4th century, what Augustine was born into is a sense of a Christian triumphalism. The sudden collapse of persecuting pagan order directed by providence and managed by the divinely instituted government. Rome was God's plan and purpose, a Christianized Rome. And so Eusebius adopts the Pax Deorum and asserts the empire's role as part of the divine plan. God meant the Rome to convert. Notice this deep either-or vision that he brings to it. God wanted Rome to convert and planned for Rome's conversion for the expansion and extension of the gospel. It was acting as a divine agent, sanctioned by God. Now that's an awful lot of authority to give to a civic association. But notice the authority he gives. Here, Prudentius, we still sing his hymns in many of our churches. Prudentius the poet. Rome fled from her old airs and shook the dark mist from her wrinkled face, her nobility now ready to enter on the ways of eternity and follow Christ at the calling of her great leader, that is the emperor. Or, now all mankind united in the rule of Remus. Who's Remus? What? Anyone know who was Remus? Mythical founder of Rome, along with his brother Romulus. United in the rule of Remus, customs is actually the word there is laws. Laws once diverse, now agree in speech and thought. This was destined in order that the authority of the Christian name might bind with one tie all that is anywhere on earth. I mean, that's shocking stuff to read. You couldn't imagine a Christian in the 2nd century or the 3rd century saying anything like that. This is a complete shift, theological, mental, political, cultural shift in the way of assessing the world around them. And so it's into this that Augustine comes. He wrote 93 books, 92 of which we still have. He gave up to 10,000 sermons. We have hundreds of his letters. That's, by the way, the image of him that can be found in the Gregory the Great's Lateran Palace down underneath the Scala Sancta in Rome. It's an archaeological dig. Jonathan Kirkpatrick and I were given permission to go down and look at it some years back, so that's from when we were down there. There are just some of the key dates, if you know Augustine or interested in Augustine. There's some of the key dates in his work, life. So into this, Augustine comes and critiques the kind of position that he has found in the world around him. And it begins with rethinking the problem of evil. So the evil for Augustine was not a thing. It was not some sort of thing. Now, if we were to go survey people around us and ask them, is evil a thing? Is evil out there or some sort of thing? I think the common response would be yes. Plausible? There's a problem with that. If you assert that evil is some sort of thing, anyone within a monotheistic tradition, so it's not just Christians, anyone in a monotheistic tradition has an immediate particular problem. What is that? What's that? Did God create evil? Where did all things come from? God creates something out of nothing. Evil, therefore, must come from God, if you think it's a thing. That's, by the way, why that played a role in Augustine's fleeing from the faith as a teenager. So if you know something about Augustine's biography, he grew up in North Africa, Roman North Africa, somewhat of Berber stock, probably his mother of Berber stock, father a petty Roman official. And we don't know if he was Berber or not. We don't really know his name. Calls him Patricius, which just means father. His mother Monica, though, is named after a Berber goddess. And Augustine grew up in a tradition that was very literalistic, very fundamentalistic of the church through his mother, and very much had this sense of evil as something very external, very powerful, and a thing. And Augustine, who had this deep intuition and desire for the goodness of God, questioned this. And that's what caused him to leave the church, go into Manichaeism for a time before he found his way back. So what's privation theory? He gets this from another philosopher but completely transforms it. Evil, for Augustine, is not a thing, but a lack of thingness. It's a corruption or corrosion. I love bicycling. I just this weekend took a bike apart and put it back together because I like things that work well. I like mechanical things. I like things that work efficiently. I hate bikes with a corrupt chain, a corroded chain, rust. But what Augustine is telling us is, and that I intuitively, instinctively know, because I have to ride for my old bike in town, one like this, even a corrupt chain, a corroded chain, a rusty chain, is still a usable chain. For Augustine, evil is not a bad thing, but a thing that has been corrupted. It's been disrupted. It's been corroded. Think of that rust on the chain. It is something that has lost some of its integrity, but not all of its integrity. Now, Augustine has a critical assumption here, which you might agree or disagree with. His critical assumption is all things come from God, and therefore anything that comes from God has an innate goodness to it. So if it is a thing, it is good. All things that exist have a degree of goodness. So what evil does is it comes in and it disrupts that goodness. It undermines it. It breaks down its integrity. But like that chain, that doesn't mean it has lost all function. Just because something is corrupted doesn't mean it is useless. And that is a key piece to understand here. Just because it is corrupted, just because it's afflicted, doesn't mean it is completely useless. Now, I wouldn't choose to use that bicycle with the bad chain for a 50-mile bike ride. It loses certain kinds of utility. And even where it's useful, it's not very enjoyable because it squeaks. Evil is a kind of corruption. It's a little bit like, I've got the Pusey House term card here. It's a little bit like if Father George were handing out that to everybody. That's the term card, and that's what you got. And we at SCIO said, okay, as part of your program here, you need to be at everything that Pusey is offering this term. Where does that leave you? Okay, good. That's a critical one for. Okay. Is it a completely useless bit of information for you? It's not the full. But you could also do something more with it, right? You could use that as a basis to go out and find out, is there something more there? maybe there's something more to look at. For Augustine, that's how he wants us to understand the problem of evil. It disrupts. It corrupts what we've got. It tears it down. It breaks it down in a way that it's not perfect. It's fragmented. We live deeply fragmented lives in an Augustinian framework. So the surprise is not when we face fragmentation. The surprise is actually when we miss the fact that there's fragmentation. It's not, is there a fragmented institution here and a whole institution there? It's what degree of fragmentation does each institution face and experience and have to work through? We have degrees of fragmentation that are a part of our lives. And so he recasts this core issue. So the effect of evil it is structural, but it doesn't completely destroy. What's absolute evil in an Augustinian framework? Do your thinking about this. Given what I've told you, what would absolute evil be? Louder. Nothing, exactly. There is no such thing as absolute evil. There is absolute good, but we can't absolutize evil because nothing's left if we do. So there is good, and there are degrees of goodness. There is one good, God, and there are degrees of goodness of those things that have been corrupted below that. So when we are living life, to live is to manage corruption. How often have you heard that said? Have you ever heard that said? To live and to live well means we have to manage corruption. Think about all the things you have to contend with. We are often managing corruption. That's what wisdom calls us to do. Wisdom is developing the art, the skill, the knowledge base, the quality of life and the quality of judgment that allows you to manage corruption well. So, go back, if I were to pop back to this church, putting ourselves into their framework, they're having to manage, if you will, corrupt signaling around them to make decisions about how to work, how to live, how to thrive. Very important to Augustine is the doctrine of creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. God brings something out of nothing. What evil does is tries to make nothing out of something. The Oxford Fantacists, you will recognize this in them. You read the Oxford Fantacists, and they understood this way of thinking, didn't they? Where did orcs come from? Corruption of elves. Lewis, Tolkien, Williams, read Williams' wonderful novels. They get this. They're shaped around this notion that shapes the theological vision that they brought to play. The image of God, as a result of thinking this way, Augustine changed his theology. Now, there are certain theological traditions that say the imago Dei, or the image of God, is something that was lost at the fall. Augustine has a major problem with that way of defining it. For Augustine, the image isn't lost at the fall. What happens at the fall? It's corrupted. So the imago Dei is something that is somehow less than it ought to be within each of us. And it's the renewing of the image that Christ's redemptive work brings. Lewis got this in his essay, The Weight of Glory. He says, everyone you meet has an eternal destiny either for heaven or hell, but they have an eternal destiny because of being image bearers. There is this deep sense. And so Augustine, in his redefinition, uses this language of dislocation or alienation, alteration of life. We are alienated first from God. Because I'm alienated from God, and he thinks of this historically as well as personally. So starting in the garden, alienated from God. And if I can't get along with God, I'm not going to get along with myself. So I'm alienated from within. Think of Paul in Romans 7. I know the right and I want to do it, but I can't. Dear God, what is wrong with me? Have mercy upon me, O Lord. And if I can't get along with God and I can't get along with myself, well, how on earth am I going to get along with you? So there's social alienation. And finally, we're alienated from the cosmos, from creation. The creation, by the way, is not alienated from God. He completely rejects that. That would be a wrong, as some interpret it, him as saying, but that would be a wrong interpretation of Augustine. Not that the creation gets alienated from God, but we are alienated. Not that the creation gets alienated from God, but we ourselves are alienated from creation. And we experience that in different ways every day. So, let me just give you a few texts, and then I'll start to bring this to bear in the focus on what this means for the academy, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So, here are some of the texts. It was made clear to me that all things are good, even if they are corrupted. They could not be corrupted if they are supremely good. But unless they are good, they could not be corrupted. The very fact that they are made by God, given and that there is the potential for alteration. That is, God has not predetermined all. There's not a static state. There's not complete stasis. Corruption is a built-in possibility to the nature of the universe in which we live. Unless they're good, they could not be corrupted. If supremely good, they'd be incorruptible, but that's only God. If they're not good at all, there'd be nothing in them to be corrupted because there's nothing left. As a result of sin, humans lost the natural state of being. We don't exist as we are intended, as could be. And again, God created substance, not vice. Vice is not a substance. So for Augustine, evil is a kind of qualitative impact, a qualitative effect on who we are. And so we live a life of division, of estrangement, of dislocation. He says here, my will was perverse and lust grew from it. And when I gave into it, habit was born. And when I didn't resist the habit, it became a necessity. These were the links which formed a chain. It held me fast. Or I think this is really telling, this comment from Confessions, Book 10. The power of my inner self was veiled in darkness, and I must deplore it. When my mind speculates on its own capabilities, it realizes it cannot safely trust its own judgment. I don't know myself because of this fragmentation. I'm just going to jump on. Augustine, in other works, particularly his work De Doctrina Christiana, translated best Christian Instruction, tells us that the necessary and useful institutions established by men, with men, include whatever they have agreed upon concerning differences of dress and adornment, useful for distinguishing different aspects of life. But all this part of human institutions, helpful to the necessary conduct of life, is not to be shunned by the Christian. In this work, Augustine makes a distinction between useful institutions, useless institutions, and demonic institutions. He also has divine institutions. I left that at the top end. Any of you who know Aristotle, by the way, Aristotelian ethics, will notice some connection there. And would be right to think there is some interesting connection with Aristotelian ethics. But notice, he didn't know much of Aristotle, but he knew that bit. Notice there's this sense in which he is treating institutions conceptually as those things that we agree upon. Institutions like language, or culture, or politics, or society, or the arts, or indeed education. These are the things we come together in agreement on, and he's arguing and saying, because of his thinking about privation theory, if it is useful to us, it's something we should be participating in. If it's useless, well, I think then he's saying, well, is there a waste of time? But that doesn't make it morally bad. So there are morally evil institutions, which we shouldn't participate in. He thinks of things that are directly demonic. It's not just morally evil. He describes it as of demonic origin. Human institutions, he does not describe that way. He describes it as useless. They might be corrupted, and so there may be so much evil attended to them that you need to separate yourself from it, depending on the level of corruption. But many human institutions are there to help deal with the world in which we live. And that brought him to the writing of the City of God. So in 410 AD, Rome is sacked, something that was unimaginable to the Romans. Couldn't have happened, shouldn't have happened. To them, they had this ideology of that Rome had existed for 800 years, peace, in full bliss and peace. Well, there's a nice myth, and not a very true myth. A deeply falsifiable one, quickly falsifiable one. Augustine, in the face of this collapse, think about what I told you about the Pax Deorum, the ideas of Eusebius and of Constantine. You had two groups who were reacting to the sack of Rome. You had the Christians and you had the pagans. The pagan intellectuals were saying, you Christians, this was your fault. Rome only got sacked because you brought in this foreign religion, Pax Deorum. This is your fault. So if you read the City of God, the first half is written in critique of the pagans and their position. But the interesting part, and I think the most interesting, the dynamic part of his work, and actually the most theologically rich part of his work, is his critique of the Christian position. Books 11 to 22, the second half roughly, takes up a critique of Christian ideology, the Christians who are saying, how could God have allowed this? Rome was God's city, working for God's purposes. The gospel was going across Roman roads. Where was God? And his richest theological and as frankly most critical theological assessment comes in attacking that position, challenging that position, and providing an alternative. And in the midst of this, he develops this apologetic of the civitates peregrina, the resident alien. He uses this language of resident alien to describe what he understands that we should be. That was actually Roman legal definition of a civitates peregrina. We have something like that here in England. We call that indefinite leave to remain. Or in the in the US, it's described as a green card. That is, an immigrant who has a right to stay, to work, to pay their taxes, by the way, having done that in two worlds. But it gives you a place. But the thing about a resident alien, somebody who doesn't have full rights to be there, is their identity is altered by that. You don't identify fully in the country where you're a resident alien because you remember you came from some other place and you might be headed to some other place. There is this world in between, but nor do you ignore the needs or values or customs of the place where you are. As a resident alien, you follow the laws, you pay the taxes, you engage in that world, you handle it responsibly. And this becomes the language that he wants to convey to the Christians, the idea. It's interesting, by the way, that Augustine titles the book and uses the image throughout the book of city, not kingdom. It would be a natural. Think about John preached the kingdom of God. Jesus preached the kingdom of God. That would have actually been the most natural language, biblical language for him to use to describe what he was doing. He chose city because it fit the idea of Rome, but it also did something else. It helped him identify and help us identify what does it mean to be part of a society. How do you engage with a society well? Whether you're talking about a grand, large cultural society like a country, or a particular society like maybe it's a club, or maybe it's a university. So he is thinking about this idea of participation. For Augustine, the two cities are neither wholly identified with the church or the state, nor are they completely disseparated. They're I can't say the word, inextricably interwoven. You don't look at the church I go to. So I go to a little church in one of the outlying villages, a little parish church. You don't say that's the city of God, and Whitehall or Oxford University is the city of man. You don't say this chapel is the city of God. Sorry, George. You don't claim this is the city of God. It is interwoven because the city of God is found where you have those who follow the will of God perfectly. The city of man is where you find those who completely reject the will of God. And in many places, it is a mixture. So what Augustine is trying to do is to, in the face of a culture that tends to like to set things, and his did, believe me, likes to set things into a very either-or, bipolar structure Either you're of this bit or you're of that bit. Either you are of Rome or you are of the church. Either you are a Christian removed from society or you are not a Christian. He is trying to challenge a notion that we can live with very simplistic, simple, and he would call them overly simplistic, distinctions that divide them. And this leads to a kind of dynamic tension. Augustine inherited a culture, a theology, a tradition that divided the world into the sacred and the secular. Divided the world into the sacred and the secular as two opposing forces. Make sense? See how that fits what I was, I had a whiteboard. I would do some other things with it here, but to express it. Think about how we use the word secular often today. Just free associate for a moment. When you hear the word secular, what do you think of? Come in. Louder, please. Music, okay. Secular. Keep coming. Culture. And do you use music and culture? Do you use that with a good, bad, or neutral intonation? Neutral? Depends. Interesting answers in both cases. Other things you think of, you hear secular. Okay, rejection of Christianity. Keep coming. What else do you think of when you hear the word secular? Hollywood. Sorry? Hollywood. Without God. You know what the word means? It's a Latin word. It comes from the Latin. It's the adjectival form of the word saeculum. Saeculum means the world. Age and space. It's a little bit like the Greek cosmos. You can't map it exactly to cosmos, but very similar to cosmos in Greek. It is the space and place where we live. It's the space and place that God made. So when we say the secular is evil, we're saying God created evil for Augustine. And what Augustine does is he takes this very bipolar definition between the sacred and secular and says it's an insufficient definition. It's distinction. An insufficient distinction. And he adds in for us the third, the profane. Notice, those of you who know medieval music will be familiar with this because you have this tradition in particularly 13th, 14th, 15th century church music of the sacred, the secular, and profane that gets drawn in. And some of the popular cultural music carries some of those ideas. So you have the sacred, that which is purely for God. You have the secular, which is that middle space. For Augustine, secular is everything that's made by God. This podium, I guess this is a pulpit because we're in a church. This pulpit is a secular item. It's made of wood. It's a thing. The pews you're sitting on are secular items. The stone that makes up this church are secular items. Language, the words that I'm using to speak to you are secular items. They are conceptual structures that we've agreed upon. And you hopefully understand a modicum of what I'm saying because we speak the same language to a certain extent. These are secular items. And so Augustine wants to understand secular as this middle ground of that which gets used either for the glory of God or against the glory of God. Can be used for or against. Think about the word profane, much like the word privation. Profane starts with what? Think about what is profane language? What is it to profane something? What are you doing with profane language? You're taking ordinary human experiences and perverting them into a way of talking with others or describing them or using them to react to something. Yes? But it's all the things that we talk about as profane language are actually languages about real human experiences that God created. To profane it is to twist it, so it loses its virtue, its value, and much of its value. So he wants us to think in these three terms to learn how to live in contested space. It's in this context that he says in book 19, chapter 7 of the City of God, that we must make use of the peace of this city. It is born essentially of the same stuff. It is a reflection of the divine peace. And if the peace of this city, meaning the political city, helps us pursue the peace of God, so much the better. Make use of it, participate in it, work with it. Our identity is not locked up in our culture, our place, our space, nor is it locked up in something that's wholly ethereal and separate from this space. We are real, concrete beings in this space, needing to make good use of it. My mentor, Robert Marcus, used this phrase, that Augustine's view allowed him to give space to areas of subtler shades. He located the secular in the sacrum, in the intermediate and temporary realm in which human affairs unfold before the end. Sacred and profane were too starkly final, too ultimate, too closely tied up with salvation and damnation to describe temporal affairs, as in the here and now. So what does this mean? Let me bring this to a close, and then we'll have time for some questions and discussion or critiques. I don't want you to follow Augustine. I want you to decide it for yourself, and maybe this is a model that's helpful. Maybe this can spur some thinking. Augustine has this key thing. You may have used this phrase, all truth is God's truth. Well, it's Augustine who coined that phrase in his work in De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian instruction. All truth is God's, which is clear and distinct, but it's expressed in and through human culture. And human culture is opaque. It's fragmented. It's problematic, whether it's church culture or political culture in a society. I'm not saying there's not. There's a continuum. There's better and worse. But there is no perfect in this world. It's a tangled web we live in. The sacred is a creator, so it's good, but fallen and deeply afflicted, whether state, culture, or church. It's afflicted, and we live with having to manage that. And therefore, achievement and failure are both ambiguous. That's something important for us as scholars to remember. We sometimes forget that. Achievement and failure are both ambiguous. And they're ambiguous particularly in the context of what I've been describing about demonstrating the purposes of God. Think about how often in war the different sides claim God to be on their side. In wars. Or in culture wars. Not just military wars. Different sides claim the divine. The work of God is far more ambiguous, whether it's in the academy or in society. We live, as Christians, we live as a citizen of one world, which is universal, sacred, and mysterious, participating in another that's contingent, uncertain, fragile, and fragmented. And so the challenge is, how do you live well with that? How do you live at peace with others? How do you learn to receive and show grace in a culture of fragmentation? And yet that's the call for the Christian. It does make me very wary of utopian dreams. And I believe that was part of Augustine's critique of the city of God, to be wary. Both the Roman pagan intellectuals and the Christian Romans had conceptualized a utopian Rome. Two different Romes, by the way, of course. But both of them, it was a utopian vision. And Augustine would have nothing of it. Reject utopias. They're simplistic. They're wrong. I need to just express a sense of being in a university then. For Augustine, education, culture, the arts are all ways of knowing more about the world. And that has a value. If all truth is God's truth, it all has a value. I don't have to slap an ichthus, that is a little Jesus fish. I don't have to put a little fish on it and be able to express it in always in a distinctly Christian manner for it to be true. And therefore, I don't always have to express it that way for it to have value. I'm not saying that there are not things that we can't express where we can see a very particular Christian expression. We can. There are things. But sometimes you come across the attitude that unless one can name it explicitly and show it as a Christian thing, well, therefore it must not be part of the truth of the divine world. The world is too big, too complex, too confusing and opaque for that to be readily the case. And so, expectations of what can be accomplished in a secular space, I believe, for me at least, and if you follow this, if this way of Augustinian thinking is useful to you, perhaps you would find it this way, it tempers your expectations. I often find that my job is to manage corruption, manage fear, manage uncertainty, because they are endemic in a world that's fragmented, and also within me. Here's a set of images I find really helpful to think about when I think about what does it mean to be a Christian in the space in which we live. How many of you have seen these images in real time, in their place? So the Raphael rooms at the Vatican, spectacular, aren't they? It's a room not quite as, it's a room about half the size, about half the length of the main chapel here, I'd say, and about the height up to the top of the walkway, a flat roof. And on one side, the upper register is filled with the image that most people know, School of Athens. Probably half the universities in the world at one time or another have used it for their marketing campaigns, right? That's the best known of the images. But on the other wall, so that's taking up one wall. Then on the obverse and reverse, the front and back walls, there are two other images. And I don't even remember those at the moment, so I won't bring those into the story. But the image on the other wall is this. Not as well known, but just as important, the disputation, disputa, disputation on sacrament. By the way, there's Augustine sitting there, and that's the city of God at his feet. You can just, with the magnifying glass, you can see the words. What's interesting about these two images, when you walk in, I guess I have to stand by the mic, sorry. When you walk in to the room and you're looking at, and those of you who've been there remember this, you can look at one image fully. So I can stand and look at the School of Athens, take it in, pay attention to the detail, be interested in it, be awed by it. And then I can turn around and look at the Disputa. Likewise, be awed by it, image, amazing painting, really insightful in many different ways, very significant, a major piece of work by Raphael. And I can take them both in. But notice, Raphael is not allowing me to fully see them simultaneously. I have to spin around. But there's another aspect of this that Raphael, the way he painted this, allows you to do. You can stand at one end of the room and see both images simultaneously, but not perfectly, because the perspective is distorted because you're looking down the room. And so it's with some distortion that if you try and look at both of them together at once. Now, what I want to convey, I think that's just an amazing setup. I think he understood Augustine. Raphael was reading City of God. No, I don't know if he was reading City of God when he did this. What I find interesting, and I think is a salutary lesson, is what Raphael does is he makes me the mediator of these two images. He makes the viewer the mediator of these two images. When you walk into the room, you're trying to take them in. It's you standing there who looks at one, turns around, looks at the other, maybe goes to the end and looks at them a little bit with some distortion in the perspective. You are the mediator. You are the bridge that is connecting these two worlds. And I think that is a great way of understanding and interpreting how does this Augustinian theology work, thinking about how do you participate in the culture. In this case, it's the academic culture of the modern university that one can contribute to. You are the bridge, bridging together different forms of knowledge, bridging together the love of Christ, bridging together a vision for the community, bridging together a commitment to justice, bridging together a vision for truth. All these different pieces, you're standing in the middle, bridging them together. And so what Augustine has done for me and offered me as I was wrestling through this and why I convey it to you, and for the SCIO students at a later session, I'll be personalizing this a lot more and talk through how this has shaped more particular things I've done in life and understanding how I've drawn into it. So this is really setting up the theological framing, the historical and theological framing. this sets up a way of thinking about how can you thrive in a modern academy. It's not us, them. It's not that secular academy out there and we have this religious world here and it's completely either or. There are strains of emphasis in each place. We know amazing people, amazing Christians who are part of the broader academy. We know amazing Christians who are part of this church community. We also know less than amazing people who are part of both. We live in this world of fragmentation. And so it's not a question of is the university fragmented and the church whole, or is the pagan, I didn't mean that, I said it, is the secular university something so fragmented, and alien and wrong that where I can have no place, and therefore I need to retreat to only a Christian educational setting. I can only do it in the confines of Pusey House or of a Christian university or fill in the blank. And this does not deny the significant place that any of those offer, but it's challenging the ideology that says it's the only option, as if there's merely an either or, a bipolar vision, that there is a potential to thrive in both places because the ministry of Christ is expansive, extensive, and all truth is his. Why don't I leave it at that? That may have seemed long to you, but that was given that it's based on about 15 of Augustine's books, one of which is 1,000 pages long in English translation. That was a dance through Augustine's thought. And as long and drawn out as that may have seemed to you, that was actually a very tiny summary with many important things left out. So, questions, conversation, critiques.
We have a microphone, so can we pass around the microphone?
Yes.
And I also pass around two things. I'm going to pass around a little clipboard. If any of you would like to receive a weekly email with descriptions of lectures happening at Pusey House, please sign your name and email address to this. Do that. And I don't know if I could start.
Sure.
I'll use this. This may be an unfair question, but it's one I ask often, and you've brought me to it. So, if we imagine St. Augustine relaxing of an evening with one of the BBC's crime dramas, perhaps an older one, I don't know, but in a world where you could say God may be present through some of the better principles which animate the best of the police officers, a kind of aspiration towards a certain kind of goodness, which we would see anchored in a divine goodness. But the show usually is entirely devoid of any notion of what is transcendent or a destination beyond an enclosed-in world. Does St. Augustine give us tools to find ourselves as pilgrims in that kind of a world, or you know, does he give us tools to analyze that from the kind of perspective you're encouraging, that we see ourselves as resident aliens, even in that kind of drama from which God seems to be removed, and not even intentionally, just not even thought of?
Well, my wife and I are currently rewatching, for maybe the second or third time, Foley's War, which is a nice one to draw upon for answering that.
Indeed, yes.
Where there is a sense that in a time of war, so Foley's War, if you don't know this, it's actually ITV, not BBC, so I hope that's still okay. It's acceptable?
Yes,
Okay.
The reason my trouble with my BBC analogy, of course, is that I didn't, yes, excellent,
Okay.
even better.
I'm waiting with bated breath. So this takes place during World War II, before America comes into the war, and at the very beginning stages of it, at least the part of the series I'm in now. And the question is, why would a policeman stay a policeman and not go over and fight when his son friends, everyone around him is contributing to the war effort, and his war effort is ordinary policing and in almost always murder sleuthing. And his response to this, and I think there is actually a deeply Augustinian vision to this particular series, or Christian vision of sorts. He says in Foley, the main character, over and over again comes to the conclusion that murder most foul is always foul, whether there's a war going on, because there's actually almost always a war going on, or not. People matter. And so there is a dignity that needs to be restored to the world through his work of policing to honor the value of the people. And I think there's a neat analogy there for thinking about the world that we live in. War is always on. Think about, Lewis takes that up in the big question, also during World War II, when he gave the sermon over at the University Church, Learning in Wartime. And you had the students going off to fight, those who were left feeling guilty, and he was saying war is always on. There's always a place for study, not just when there's war on, because war is always on. If we said don't study, go off to war because war trumps all things, well, you would never have study. So there is a dignity to reality, to honoring and seeking truth in seasons, whether they be easy or wrong. So there's a quick one possible answer. Yeah.
I guess this is more of a clarifying question,
Yeah,
but
please, because I skipped over a lot.
no, that's okay. But just considering what you were saying about evilness and how it doesn't exist, would that imply that Satan and hell, like there's something about both of them that is somewhat good?
So in the theological tradition, that's a really, really interesting question and a right one to ask. It's a clever question, because if God created all things, and remember within the tradition of Christian theology, where does Satan come from? Fallen angel. So there is a goodness there. And if Satan were absolute evil, there would be two consequences, neither of which are workable. One consequence is he's actually nothing. The other consequence is he's the equal to God, and we create a dualism. So he can't be absolute evil. And to the extent that he still exists, there is still the tiniest fragment of goodness, perhaps. But that's what makes him usable in God's economy. That in the economy of God, God can use evil for the purposes of good. If we're absolute evil, that would not be possible. So there is something. It doesn't justify it. Doesn't say he's a good thing. Doesn't say warm up to him. But don't make him obliviate him. Is that a word? Nor or make him too much. Absolutize him, because either option, if you don't think seriously about the potential for good there, creates havoc. Mental, theological, and cultural, ethical havoc, rather. Is that helpful? And so he doesn't, this is not to deny the demonic. This is to relativize it and put it in its place, in context. It's not the sole answer. Augustine, one of the things that Augustine did, remember I said that there was this culture of professionalism, this culture of identifying evil as something out there, either the state or as the demonic. And what he did is he challenged both of those. Augustine, really for the first time in Western society, treated evil as an interior problem that affects me. I'll let you speak for yourself. But he interiorized that the problem, that deep down, the problem that each of us have in life is within ourself as the first order of business. Now, it doesn't mean, there are more evil people out there. I think there are more evil people than me out there. I think Hitler was more evil than me. Don't have to justify that. Don't have to ignore that. But rather than focusing solely on the evil that's out there, we have to take careful attention and take stock of the evil that is within. And what Augustine does is he turns to the interior person rather than these external structures and beings as the cause of our problems. The starting point for work, if you will. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Here we have about 5 minutes. We have to tie up at 5:20. We
Okay.
at even song next door, some evening prayer 506. Anybody here is welcome to join us if you like. I may ask John Winsome to say a few words about highlights of return prayer at 5:20.
Okay.
Thank you. I have another clarifying question, if that's okay.
Yes, clarifying questions are always good.
I think if I heard you correctly when you were talking about dislocation and alienation, you said that when it comes to the cosmic dimension, Augustine doesn't think that creation is alienated from God. He thinks we're alienated from creation. Was that correct?
Correct.
In that case, how does he deal with what we might call natural evil? So, natural disasters.
Well, I've written on that one extensively, so I'll try and give a very short answer to that because of the time we have. For Augustine, anything that is made by God has contingent being. It is not self-existent. It is contingent existence, which means if it is made, it can also be unmade. Decay, then, is built into the order of the cosmos. Decay is a natural part of growth. Think about growth and decay. So there are, amongst those who would say that this becomes an important debate in the science and religion conversations. You don't have to ask the question, did suddenly the grass start turning brown after the fall? Like, could the grass not have turned brown and leaves fall off the trees? As if somehow there wasn't a coherent structure to the cosmos when God created. For Augustine, the cosmos is going to have physiological, not moral or social, but physiological decay naturally and necessarily a part of its existence because it's a created thing. Whether it was created 13 billion years ago or you go for a young earth creation, it's still the same. It's a created thing. And so for Augustine, there is no such thing as natural evils. And it's important to know that that's a term. The earliest I can find that term used is by Leibniz. I'm not sure if that's the earliest. That's only the earliest I've been able to push it back finding it. I think it's a really problematic and unhelpful term. Because what we do by using that language, we say that tornado, or very pertinent to many of us right now is those hurricanes, must be evil things, and how could God allow that? Instead of saying and thinking, okay, is this part of the system and structure of the world? So think about it. Let's not talk about hurricanes. Let's talk about earthquakes. Well, earthquakes come because we have moving continental plates, right? There's movement in the earth. Well, we need that movement of the earth happens because there's a spinning nickel core. At least we think it's nickel. There's some rethinking going on about that now, isn't there? That is what is all necessary to have a biosphere that can sustain life. So we need a spinning nickel core to move the earth that helps being part of the structure that makes a biosphere viable so we can have oxygen to breathe, so we can have life as we know it. So to have life as we know it means that there are going to be events that are problematic physiological events that are problematic for us. So to call those natural evils, I think profoundly distorts an understanding of the cosmos. And that is a way of defining these problematic events that only came about, so far as I'm aware and can find, in the early modern world. Earlier generations of Christians, secularists, pagans, other religions, other philosophies did not use that term. And I think that really sets us up for some of the major problems we have thinking through these issues these days. I think it's been a pernicious term, frankly, coined that really undermines serious argument, because that's what shapes Hume's famous dictum. So if you remember Hume, Either God is good, or there are three statements. God is good, God is evil, there is evil, God is omnipotent. And you can have any two but not three of those. As soon as you try to have three of those, you've got a real problem, according to Hume. That is driven by this notion, by I think, a distorted understanding of the problem of evil, which privation theory, frankly, helps solve. Is that helpful? There's one back here. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question on the spectrum of fallenness. And so to claim a spectrum of fallenness is to claim a spectrum of truthfulness found in something. It's going to take, or at least that will, because the truth is so fragmented, one would need to toil a little harder to piece the truth together compared to something that's more fragmented than the other. And so, for example, an anti-intellectualist Christian could say, why would I confuse myself and my children, wasting my time sifting and piecing fragments when I can get the purest truth? And of course, we can't get pure truth because, like you said, we live in a world, a secular, like our Bible is in language, your pulpit is made of wood, but ideally we'd want the 99.9% virgin olive oil or something like that of truth. So I guess the question that these people might be asking is why not just consider theologians or Kierkegaard? Why consider atheists, philosophers or scientists or like BBC movies and TV shows that are blatantly far secular? And to add to that, as an academic Christian, academic Christian, where should we stop ourselves? At what point is it too secular, too fragmented?
It's a really salient question, and it's one that really drives us in many ways. First off, I begin with the sense that all truth is God's truth, as you've heard, but also that truth, as you remembered and used, truth is fragmented. And I'm limited and finite. I'm fragmented. Kierkegaard was fragmented. Augustine was fragmented. We are people of our times that are limited. That's why theology continues as a discipline. Theology is not static because it is, the discipline of theology is doing doctrinal thinking in a time and place, in a culture, trying to make sense of doctrinal ideas across time, in a particular time, in our particular time, and recognizing that other times have interpreted in ways that perhaps didn't work. But so we come into this as fragmented people needing multiple inputs. And I need to take advantage of all image bearers to know and learn. I need to grow be open to all image bearers, which, as I understand it, would be all humans, not just a particular sect or segment of humans. So I need to learn from all image bearers and be open to them because they may have an insight into truth that I haven't begun to grasp, or a knowledge of or awareness of a question to be asked that it's never crossed my mind to ask. They may either have the information or a piece of information, more likely, or they might have a question. Either one is great to help put me on the path. Secondly, all conversation happens through fragmented mediums. All discovery, all relationship happens through fragmented mediums. We might do it through the fragmentation of the English language. Or more particularly, we might do it between the fragmentation of American English, like you hear out of my mouth, and Canadian English, as you would hear out of George, and British English, can I say this, Ian? Out of Ian's mouth. Sorry, that's my bus, which I'm not taking. And so we, by denying our ability to engage conversations broadly, we're actually denying that our mechanism for even understanding the most basic aspects of life are fragmentary, are distorted, are painfully unaware of a bigger world. It's a longer conversation, and I'm going to actually take that up a bit more in another week with you guys. So I'll be coming back to this for the SKIO group with our vocation. But there's another piece, is I think in doing that we deny, sorry, not in doing what you're doing, but those who ask that question, I think they're denying the infinitude and eternality of God. Because if God is immortal, eternal, infinite, and wise, as we sing, then truth can never be parochial. Truth can never be narrowly held in a tiny little pockets. And no little pocket can contain the whole wisdom of the divine. And so it's up to me, up to us, to seek, to discover, to look, to find, and to recognize that the way the universe works, the way humans interact, the way language develops, the way that ships move through water, all the vast quantity of things that we study in a modern university are all part of a world that God has made. And understanding that, we understand something about the divine. There's a great tradition about this that I'll end with, which Augustine also coined. Sorry, this is not to be all Augustine all the time, but you perhaps have heard the phrase, the two books analogy. Augustine coined that phrase. It got picked up and used particularly in the medieval world and the early modern, but he coined that phrase in his work against Faustus. And for Augustine, there are two books. And if you go to the Natural History Museum and stand and look at the gateway, the entryway to the Natural History Museum, you see this represented. There's an angel there, and he's holding a dividing cell at the apex of what looks like a church entrance, notice. He's holding a dividing cell in one hand and a book, as in the Book of Life or Bible, not sure which, but both amount to the same thing, in the other. The two books analogy says that there are multiple ways of knowing and understanding God, and they are not isolated, they're not separated completely, they are differentiated, and they each tell us something different that is complementary, and we are richer, we are better, we are fuller, we are more human by being able to draw upon the whole range of the knowledge of the divine. And so, to only depend on the book, as important as that book might be, for the knowledge of the divine, we lose something important about the divine. Those who want to study the Bible need sciences. Let me tell you, sorry, I'm going to finish with this bit. Here's an example of how this has been important to me. So I, like many at one time in my thought, I think I would have identified I don't think I ever put into words, but I think I thought of the imago Dei somehow being related to biological form. And that way of thinking has, I will say, maybe hopefully this is not offensive, it has all sorts of pernicious impact and influences when you think that. Because if you start thinking in terms of the imago Dei, the image of God, being somehow connected to our biological form, then you can begin talking about migrants in a different way that is not godly or correct. Or you can talk about the disabled in a way that is not godly or correct. Or you can talk about other kinds of beings in a way that's not godly or correct when you start identifying. And this, by the way, is why many, where you find, I think it's been very a problematic approach for many dealing with the science and religion conversations, because then, well, how do you think about human evolution if you identify? It makes it really impossible to think about human evolution if you hold that the imago Dei is of biological design. It was thinking seriously about the sciences and working and learning from my friends who are biologists, paleobiologists, and likewise, that made me step back and rethink that position and re-understand it. I am a better theologian, I think. Others might disagree. I think I'm a better theologian because of the time I spent with a scientist who taught me to think more seriously about the world in a new and fresh way, who challenged me in rethinking what I understood about, they didn't even know they were doing it. It became patently obvious to me. Their language was challenging me to rethink about the nature of the image of God. And then I had to go back to Scripture and reevaluate, what does the Imago Dei mean in Scripture? And it turns out there's nothing about biology. It has nothing to do with biological form in Scriptural. But it took the scientists learning from a different discipline that enabled me to come back to Scripture in a fresh and new way and see what was actually patently obvious all the time. I just didn't have the eyes to see it. We need knowledge from multiple sources. We end there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.